So, the brief I often get asked to discuss, including for this Design for Education book, but also when originally approached about this talk, is about collaboratively designing tools. And that's a difficult brief because the one thing I've learned doing these kind of collaborative design projects I do is that if you focus on collaboratively designing tools specifically, you won't get very good tools. So I'm going to subvert my brief just a little bit and talk about the kind of collaborative design projects I do using an approach called the change laboratory, which uses a theory called activity theory, which positions tools very carefully within human activity systems. So the problem with tools as a focus is that tools rely very much on the context in which they're used. And the educational literature is absolutely full of cases where a tool has worked brilliantly in one place, and then somebody tries to move it to another place, and they don't get the same positive results. For that reason, the discipline of education, more so in some countries than others, is full of what we sometimes call design experiments, sometimes also called design-based research, where people try to create and nurture entire ecosystems in which the tools fit better. And that's an understandable mission, actually. The problem is that those design experiments, when looked at critically, have a number of shortcomings. And a prominent activity theorist, i.e. from the same tradition as I'm going to draw on today, Yrjö Engerström, talks about design experiments typically not starting from the question of who is really doing the designing and why should they get involved. It's typically assumed that a researcher will do the designing, and then some other people will get to either take the broad idea and make it more concrete, or take the initial tool and tweak it a bit to make it slightly better fit the ecosystem in which a designer hopes it will be used. And on the basis of that evidence, subsequently what happens, particularly in some countries, is somebody will say, the research says this works, so now everyone else will have to use it. That approach is abhorrent to the intellectual tradition I draw on, where we want to celebrate design interventions as contested terrain, with novelty and resistance and originality, in which the participants themselves not only design the solutions, but actually understand or redefine what is the problem that we're confronting. The basic idea can be traced back to a psychologist called Vygotsky, who was working in the years immediately following the 1917 Russian Revolution, where for a brief period there was an intellectual flourishing of lots of very, very innovative ideas in a lot of disciplines. And he imagined a situation, which is not too difficult for us to imagine today, where somebody has a certain field of action. There are some things they can do, there are some capabilities they have, and that would be represented by the inner circle in what you can in the diagram you can see on the screen. And he imagined an outer circle of things that they couldn't do. And a lot of education, a lot of policy around education at least, is about understanding where that inner circle is located. It's about measuring the current ability. That wasn't Vygotsky's interests. He looked at this in a different way. He understood that the way in which people work is fundamentally mediated by tools. In fact, it's tool use that gives us abilities and psychological functions that animals don't have. So he suggested what would happen if somebody, like a researcher like him, were to give people new tools, new cultural artifacts that they could draw upon. And he started to draw attention to the fact that people who have received assistance can do more than people who have not. And he became interested in the middle of the now 3 circles that you can see on the screen. And that is what he called the zone of proximal development, the difference between what somebody can do with help and what they can't do without help. One of his colleagues came to understand that we have to understand how humans work at a range of levels, And one of those levels is action. That is what we do in a time-bound way when we have a goal to achieve, and then it's done, it's finished. And that was roughly what this colleague, Leontiev, who you can see underneath, understood Vygotsky as working on. And he said the problem with that is real humans in real settings are working in broader activities. And the actions they undertake, like me clicking this here today, only makes sense if we understand the tapestry of the broader activities in which those actions are generated. Now, if you bring these two things together, you can understand the motive, the original motive for the kind of work I'm going to describe, which is to say, what would it take to take a real activity and to give it some sort of assistance and to explore the zone of proximal development for a real human activity. For example, maybe people working in a hospital, maybe learners in a school, etc. What would that take? Can we do that? And the Change Laboratory is basically an attempt to do exactly that. It's an attempt to explore the zone of proximal development for one or more real human activity systems in which researchers work with stakeholders. And they do that so that new activity, new tools, new concepts are generated. And so sometimes when you do a project like this, you get new tools. But sometimes you don't. It's worth being clear about that from the beginning. Now, to make this work, we need two more recent theoretical innovations. The first, both of these are what we might call dual-use technologies. They've been developed within activity theory, and they explain how humans work, even when we're not doing a change laboratory, but we can draw on them to design these projects. The first is to understand what happens if a human activity system undergoes a moment of absolute crisis, has a ruptural change, and comes out of it better for wear rather than worse. And that process is called expansive learning. And recent work going back several decades by Yrjö Engerström has understood that a range of actions are generated within the activity at that moment. I won't cover them all because there's quite a few, but one of them, for example, might be questioning. Questioning what the problem is we actually face. Another might be historical analysis, understanding how this crisis has arisen historically, and so forth. These occur in cycles. The cycles are not random, although we can't exactly predict the order. It does suggest, however, this theory that modeling a new solution comes a bit later in the kind of cycle than many people might assume from common sense, where people often try and find a solution immediately. Whereas we might say in using this cycle, you might want to look at the history first. You might want to understand what problem you face first. And the second thing we draw on is this principle of transformative agency by double stimulation, which is a way of understanding how people use and adopt a range of cultural artifacts to help them break out of impasse, to break out of conflicts. Once again, they do that in real life. We can use it in the Change Lab. So what does a Change Lab really look like? What it involves is, first of all, recruiting stakeholders in a real human activity system. For example, a group of design students. Actually, it's one of the examples that will be mentioned in one of the projects I'll cover on a later slide. We then conduct workshops. Now, those workshops are aimed at helping people to move through expansive learning cycles. So we know there will be moments of questioning, moments of historical analysis, and all the rest of it. And we will draw on double stimulation task designs, which means, among other things, for every task, we want a guidance, a piece of a thing that the people are supposed to do, some concrete examples, and a theoretical framework to help them. And what we do is we try to guide people through cycles of actions that will enable them to move from their current problematic situation to a situation that they might find preferable, whilst also boosting their agency to actually make the change they want. Historically, this has tended to happen in rooms with projector screens and flip charts and pieces of large paper on tables and all sorts of things. More recent work, including stuff I've been doing, has done it with distributed stakeholders online, where we're using Zoom and Canva and all sorts of online whiteboard tools like Miro. So let's look just briefly at 4 projects. The first involves some university mathematics lecturers, and they are struggling to incorporate ICT into their teaching. And they believe at the beginning the problem is that willing lecturers are having their progress obstructed by the unwilling ones. Okay? A second project involves students working with laptops, because they've all been given free laptops by this university, and yet, despite liking the laptops, still dropping out of their program, therefore not really fulfilling the purpose of the project. A third involves students who are in a design discipline being asked to incorporate digital artifacts into their portfolios and being unwilling to do so. And a fourth involves reconceptualizing a very, very opaque, difficult to understand policy in a Korean university, which is particularly difficult to understand if you're not Korean, and that's becoming an important problem since the Korean government's having quotas now. Okay, so that's the starting point. So in each case, a coalition is forged. You could have a coalition based on the mathematics lecturers teaching in this semester, or you could have a coalition of all of the people in this unit who support these students with the laptop, or you could have a coalition of both students and faculty who are involved in the design portfolio work, or a coalition of people from across this university in South Korea. All of those were done. We have to understand, because we're working with people and asking them to do a lot of work in the actual research site where they actually work, recruitment can be a problem. And none of these had an easy time for recruitment. Okay. When we lead people through a project like this, though, what is it that we find? In every single case, we find that the initial problem was poorly understood. The initial problem I said a moment ago while standing over there is not the problem, in 0 cases. So the problem of the mathematics lecturers is not that some mathematics lecturers are unwilling, it's that the lecturers work between 2 organizational units with different rules. And the lecturers are caught between these different systems that they're supposed to pay heed to. So they start to design new activity which takes them away from both units into a mathematics disciplinary space rather than a university space. The one about laptops, the problem is not about whether the laptops are very good, or whether the students like them, because they like them. It's about the fact that they don't fit among the constellation of other artifacts that the students use, their mobile phones, their textbooks, whatever. It's assumed tacitly that the laptops will be used on their own and subsume every other tool, and it doesn't work. With regard to the Design Portfolios project, the issue is not that students are unwilling to use digital artifacts per se. It's more that they're being asked to put forward artifacts that show how good they are. And the digital artifacts seem to make it easier for people to see the flaws, so they don't use them. And in the final project, it turns out not to be about whether or not the policy is easy to understand for foreign lecturers. It's that the policy has never made sense, but people have got used to not commenting on that. And so this engagement of overseas staff is making that more visible. So tools were developed. I cherry-picked these projects because they develop tools. Many change laboratory projects in the end don't develop tools. These did. So the one about the university maths lecturers, they developed a habitat which was partly an online space where mathematics lecturers could share their stories. The second project involved developing actually a pedagogical model, which included the laptops alongside many other things. The portfolio one involved using an off-the-shelf e-portfolio tool, which is not that innovative, alongside a tagging system which is built on the developmental profile of being a design graduate rather than showing us how good you are now. Developmental tagging. And the fourth project involved building an entire new online portal. So what we can see is that the first and fourth projects actually involve people in the end in developing new environments. That's their term, not mine, but new environments, new tool environments. The middle two involved changing the context of existing instruments. And in fact, in the laptops one, it involves using the laptops rather less. It involves putting them back in their place rather than viewing them as a solution. So what can we take away from these projects? Three of these, projects 2, 3, and 4, in fact, were undertaken by students enrolled in doctoral programs at Lancaster who were primarily interested in technology-enhanced learning. And yet, these are not tool-based or technology-based projects in the end. The crucial comments are, actually finding the problem is crucial. Problem finding is at least as important as problem solving, and that's at least as important in terms of the creativity and agency. Having agency on problem finding involves saying no sometimes, not just finding a cute solution to something. It involves transformative coalitions of stakeholders. They develop the tools and the activity systems together, and they develop the agency to really make the change happen afterwards. And it's going through the process that develops that agency. The next point is that instrumentalities are contextualized. Sometimes instruments are really spectacular, and I'd be happy to design a spectacular instrument if I thought it was going to be useful, but many times they aren't. Many times what we need is a mundane instrument that actually fits, actually can be sewn into the tapestry of practice in the local setting. And the final thing is I am interested in generative solutions, things that might inspire other people to start their own change. But I'm not interested in finding generalizable solutions that I can try and impose on other settings from outside. And once again, like the previous speaker, I'm an academic. There are references if you require them. Okay, thank you.